Most people don't realize it, but there is a silent, almost invisible behavior that dominates a large part of modern human relationships: the compulsion to explain oneself all the time. It is a habit that seems harmless, even polite. After all, justifying your choices, your emotions, your absences, or mood changes can sound like empathy, like consideration for others. But behind this constant need to justify oneself lies something much deeper and more disturbing: a poorly healed psychological wound. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest names in analytical psychology, identified this pattern as a clear symptom of disconnection from the self. For him, the repeated attempt to convince others about who you are, what you feel, and why you act in a certain way actually reveals a state of self-neglect. The person who constantly explains themselves is often seeking something they never received: permission to exist. This behavior often arises in environments marked by emotional invalidation. These are contexts, often familial, where the child's subjective experience is systematically disqualified. That's nonsense. You're exaggerating. There's no reason to feel that way. The internalized message is brutal. What I feel only has value if others understand, approve, or allow it. Over time, this belief transforms into an invisible prison, where the individual becomes dependent on others' understanding to affirm their own internal reality. When an adult compulsively explains themselves, they are unconsciously trying to avoid abandonment, judgment, or rejection. They believe that if others understand their reasons, perhaps they won't criticize them, won't distance themselves, won't reject them. It is a desperate attempt to control others' perception to ensure belonging and emotional security. But this constant effort comes at a very high price: one's own psychological autonomy. By focusing on external validation, the individual begins to neglect their internal authority. They no longer act because they believe in something, but because they need to justify themselves to avoid being misunderstood. They no longer feel freely, but rationalize their emotions to avoid the discomfort of being viewed negatively. Gradually, they stop living for themselves and start acting for others, in an eternal theater where the audience has more power than the protagonist. Jung understood this phenomenon as a central obstacle on the path to individuation, the process by which a human being truly becomes who they are. And the truth is harsh. As long as there is a constant need to explain oneself, there is no inner freedom. Because compulsive explanation is a sophisticated form of submission. It is as if, with each justification, the individual says, "I can only exist if you allow it." This video is an invitation to dismantle this conditioning, a deep analysis of why so many people live trapped in the need to justify themselves, and what happens when they finally choose silence. When they decide to stop explaining themselves, something changes radically. The psyche, previously bent before external approval, begins to rise with a new posture, that of internal authority. And this transforms absolutely everything. Behind the need to explain oneself, there is something much deeper than education or the desire to be understood. It is a psychic wound embedded at the core of identity. Jung understood that this compulsion for self-explanation is not just a behavioral habit. It is a symptom, a reflection of something much older. The unconscious belief that one's existence only has value when validated by others. This wound forms early, often in childhood, in environments where the child's subjectivity is constantly delegitimized. When a child expresses sadness and hears that they are being dramatic, when they show anger and are called difficult or disrespectful, when they reveal fear and receive disdain or irony in response, they begin to internalize a dangerous message. What I feel is wrong. I can only trust the responses of others. Over time, the child develops a defense mechanism, trying to be understood to feel safe. They learn that if they explain well what they feel, they may not be punished, ignored, or ridiculed. And thus, a pattern is born that will be carried into adulthood, justifying every emotion, every decision, every attitude, as if a convincing argument were needed to have the right to feel and to be. At the root of this wound is the loss of internal authority. The person no longer sees themselves as someone whose experience is valid in itself. They come to depend on the external gaze to confirm whether what they live has legitimacy or not. This creates a psychological state of submission, where self-esteem is not built from within, but from the reflection in the eyes of others. It is important to understand that this dynamic does not happen consciously. Often, those trapped in this pattern do not even realize that they are constantly trying to convince others that their emotions are reasonable, that their decisions have logic, that their behavior has a motive. But behind every explanation, there is a hidden fear, the fear of being rejected for simply being who they are. Jung asserted that every individual needs, at some point in life, to confront this inherited internal structure. Until they do, they remain operating according to the values, judgments, and expectations of others, often internalized from authority figures in childhood, such as parents, teachers, or religious leaders. The individual becomes a reflection of what others would approve of, not of who they truly are. This compulsive self-explanation, therefore, is a form of self-abandonment. It is the act of betraying one's own truth to make it more palatable to others. And it is precisely at this point that the healing process begins, recognizing that you no longer need to ask for permission to exist, that your emotions, no matter how intense, contradictory, or strange they may seem, do not need to be justified to deserve space. But this awakening does not happen without pain. When the individual begins to silence themselves in the face of the need to justify, the silence that arises is disconcerting, because it reveals the emptiness left by the absence of a consolidated internal authority. And it is precisely about this that Jung speaks when introducing one of the pillars of his psychology, the construction of internal authority. In the next part, we will explore how this concept, central to the Jungian process of individuation, can radically transform the way someone positions themselves in the world. What does it mean to develop internal authority? And why is this the key to breaking the cycle of self-explanation? If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Compulsive self-explanation is not just a defense mechanism. It is a continuous act of self-betrayal. A silent betrayal, often imperceptible but deeply corrosive. Carl Jung understood that every time an individual shapes their words to avoid displeasing, hides their emotions to maintain harmony, or suppresses their decisions to avoid judgment, they are distancing themselves from themselves. They are, in fact, abandoning their own truth. This internal betrayal does not happen explosively, like a violent break with the self. On the contrary, it is gradual, subtle, every day. It occurs when you laugh at something you don't find funny to seem sociable, when you say yes while meaning no to avoid being seen as selfish, when you explain your sadness as tiredness because you don't want to be a burden, when you feel anger but disguise it as rationality, fearing to seem immature. With each small concession made in the name of acceptance, a part of the soul is left behind. Jung identified that this type of behavior is a direct reflection of the ego disconnected from the self. The ego, which should be merely the functional center of consciousness, becomes a servant of external acceptance. It reconfigures itself to become what others want to see. And in this constant adaptation, the individual loses touch with themselves. They stop listening to their own intuition, disbelieve their own feelings, and question their most authentic motivations. Doubt takes the place of inner confidence. This process of self-abandonment is insidious because it is socially valued. People who adjust well, who know how to explain themselves, who avoid conflicts, who are easy to get along with, are often praised. But behind this false harmony often lies a deep emotional exhaustion. An exhaustion of those who live for others, but can no longer hear themselves. Jung asserted that this type of internal fragmentation is one of the main causes of neuroses. When the ego distances itself too much from the self, the symbolic center of psychic wholeness, symptoms arise: chronic anxiety, existential crises, feelings of emptiness, difficulty in making decisions, low self-esteem. And why? Because the soul is screaming to be heard, but has been silenced in the name of social adaptation. Deep down, what is at stake here is a crucial question. Whose life is it? As long as you are constantly seeking approval to feel, think, or act, your existence will be merely a performance, an edited version of your truth. You will always be a character in someone else's narrative, never the author of your own story. The only way to break this cycle of self-betrayal is to reclaim internal authority. It is to develop the capacity to uphold your truth even when it is not understood, even when it causes discomfort, even when it challenges expectations. This is the beginning of true individuation, becoming whole, even if it means disappointing others. But how to cultivate this internal authority? How to stop depending on external understanding to affirm who you are? How to maintain silence in the face of pressure for explanations? This is precisely what Jung proposes with his concept of individuation. And this is what we will explore in depth in the next part. Because only when this authority is built does silence cease to be absence and becomes affirmation. For Carl Jung, true psychological freedom does not arise from social acceptance or external understanding. It emerges from the development of internal authority. This concept, central to his theory of individuation, represents the individual's ability to validate their own subjective experience without relying on the approval of others. It is the moment when you stop asking yourself, "Will they understand what I feel?" and start asserting, "It doesn't matter if they understand. This is true for me." Internal authority is the opposite of compulsive self-explanation. While the latter is anchored in insecurity, in the need to justify every step to be accepted, internal authority arises from the deep conviction that your truth does not need to be negotiated. And this shift is not merely intellectual. It is existential. It is a change of axis. The center of gravity of the psyche shifts. It moves from the periphery of external approval back to the center of the self, where the totality of being resides. But this transition is not simple. It requires courage, because by ceasing to explain yourself, the individual directly confronts the fear of abandonment, the fear of judgment, the fear of exclusion. Jung said that individuation requires traversing the desert of inner solitude, the moment when, for the first time, you hold a no without guilt, when you do not justify yourself for changing your mind, when you end a conversation without explaining why, not out of arrogance, but simply because you owe nothing to anyone to exist. Developing this authority does not mean becoming insensitive or closed to dialogue. On the contrary, it means that you no longer need to beg for understanding. You offer your truth as a gift, not as a plea for acceptance. Communication ceases to be a performance and becomes an authentic expression. It is the difference between speaking to be approved and speaking to be true. In practice, internal authority manifests in small daily gestures, in silence, in the face of provocation, in the firmness of saying, "That does not resonate with me," without needing to explain why. In the refusal to participate in an emotional game where you always have to justify your position. And above all, in the ability to endure the discomfort of not being understood. and still remain whole. Jung believed that this is one of the most important moments of the psychological journey, the instant when the individual stops outsourcing their self-esteem and begins to recognize it as something that arises from within. This transition is symbolic and powerful, as it marks the break with the old, conditioned self, the one that lives to please, and the birth of a new self, rooted, autonomous, whole. But this new stance is not well received by everyone. On the contrary, the silence that arises from internal authority often disturbs. People who previously benefited from your insecurity begin to lose control. Manipulators feel threatened. Relationships based on power dynamics start to crumble. And that is precisely why, when you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. In the next part, we will dive into this transformative turning point. Why does silence hold so much power? What happens to your relationships when you refuse to continue justifying who you are? Get ready, because what comes next may radically change your perception of the ties you maintain today. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Silence, when it arises from integrity and not from omission, is one of the most transformative forces of the human psyche. Jung understood this with brutal clarity. He saw silence not as an absence of response, but as a presence of authority. When someone stops justifying themselves compulsively, they are not only avoiding conflicts or cutting conversations, they are deactivating an entire system of psychological control that fed on their insecurity. This type of silence is unsettling, because for those who have always expected you to bow, to explain yourself, to correct yourself, the absence of justification is interpreted as rebellion. And, in a sense, it is. But not an immature rebellion, the kind that screams to be heard. It is a silent revolution, an implicit declaration: I owe no explanations to be who I am. Manipulative people, who feed on others' doubt, begin to lose the game, because emotional manipulation only works when there is perceptible vulnerability, when there is fear of being misunderstood, fear of being abandoned, fear of disappointing. Manipulation needs reactivity, but the secure silence, which comes from internal authority, is a stone wall. It does not respond, does not justify itself, does not dance to the music. It simply is. And this destabilizes any attempt at control. Moreover, relationships that have always depended on your submission, emotional, intellectual, or behavioral, begin to reveal themselves for what they are: fragile, one-sided, based on imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you break the implicit pact of inferiority. You cease to position yourself as someone who needs to be accepted and begin to occupy the space of someone who already accepts themselves. And this changes absolutely everything. Some people will distance themselves. And this is not a sign of error, but of realignment, because your silence begins to function as a filter. It reveals who was by your side out of genuine affinity, and who was only there because you were easy to control. Jung said that the process of individuation often requires ruptures, and this distancing is not punishment, it is liberation. When you stop justifying your presence, your boundaries, your choices, you start attracting relationships based on mutual respect, not on fear or dependence. But you need to be prepared, because by stopping to explain yourself, you will also have to deal with your own anxiety. The part of you that learned for decades that you needed to be understood to have value will resist. It will want to go back to justifying itself. It will beg you to reconsider, to explain just this once. It is at this moment that silence becomes a spiritual exercise, a conscious act of remaining whole, even in the face of discomfort. Silence, therefore, is not just the absence of words, it is the affirmation of being. It is the refusal to put your identity on trial. And the more you sustain this silence, the more it transforms into presence. A presence that emanates authority, that commands respect without raising its voice, that establishes boundaries without needing confrontation. A presence that does not need approval to exist. But the impact of silence goes beyond relationships with others. It initiates a profound process within the psyche: integration. When you stop justifying yourself, you begin to listen to yourself. When you stop rationalizing your emotions, you start to feel them fully. And that is where true transformation begins, because external silence opens space for internal listening. In the next part, we will explore this essential turning point: how the authority you gain in front of the world actually begins with an internal movement, the return to your own psychological integrity. You will understand why integrated people do not convince, they communicate, and why, when you adopt this posture, the world begins to treat you completely differently. There is something magnetic about a person who feels no need to explain themselves, something that cannot be faked or forced. It is about psychological integrity, the state of someone who no longer negotiates their own essence to fit external expectations. Jung understood this integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation, when the individual not only knows their truth, but upholds it without hesitation, without guilt, and above all, without the need for validation. An integrated person does not beg to be understood. They communicate, they express, but they do not convince, because they do not start from the premise that they need to justify their existence. Their words come from a solid center, not from a hidden lack. This changes everything in the way they are perceived. The world treats with more respect those who treat themselves with respect. And self-respect begins when you refuse to negotiate what is essential in you. Psychological integrity does not mean inflexibility. It means coherence. It is the ability to maintain an internal line of truth, even in the face of external pressure. It is when you feel something uncomfortable in a situation, and even without being able to explain it rationally, you trust your feelings. You do not need to present evidence or build elaborate arguments. You simply say, "This does not resonate with me," and that is enough. This stance, which seems simple, is revolutionary in a world where most live disconnected from themselves, where decisions are made based on the opinions of others, where feelings are ignored for fear of seeming too sensitive, and where boundaries are violated with forced smiles so as not to seem difficult. Integrity is the opposite of that. It is the art of being whole, of not fragmenting to please, of not hiding to avoid conflict. Jung knew that true transformation does not happen when you learn more theories, but when you embody a new stance towards life. And this stance begins with the refusal to justify oneself, because every compulsive justification carries a camouflaged insecurity. Am I enough? The integrated person no longer asks this question. They know they are, even when the world insists on saying otherwise. And here lies the paradox. The less you seek approval, the more respect you evoke. Because integrity has weight, it has density, it has presence. That is why, without saying a word, a centered person can alter the dynamics of an environment. They do not need to prove anything. Their internal coherence already communicates everything. People like this do not beg for space. They occupy it. They do not react out of insecurity. They act out of alignment. But there is an essential detail. This integrity is only possible when you stop betraying yourself, when you stop molding yourself to be accepted, when you give yourself permission to feel, choose, act, even if no one understands. This requires practice, requires presence, requires self-knowledge, but above all, it requires the courage to take responsibility for your own existence, without blaming others, without outsourcing your value. And when this integrity settles in, the effects are profound. Relationships change. The way you position yourself professionally changes. Your self-perception becomes clearer. Anxiety decreases. The need to control what others think disappears. Because you stop living to be understood and start living to be true. But there is something even deeper. Something that happens not only in the way you relate to the world, but in what you begin to emanate. When you stop justifying yourself, you start to emanate a new energy, that of someone who is in control of themselves. And this energy is unconsciously perceived by everyone around. This is where the invisible shift occurs. The world begins to treat you as someone who does not negotiate. In the next and final part, we will explore how this psychological integrity transforms your relationship with the external world. How, without saying a word, you come to be respected in ways that once seemed unattainable. And why, when you stop explaining yourself, the entire world changes the way it responds to your presence. When a person stops explaining themselves, everything changes, not just inside, but around them. It's as if a new frequency begins to be emitted. You no longer say, "Please understand me." You emanate, "I know who I am, and I don't need your permission." And the world inevitably responds. Jung knew that the human psyche is guided by energy, by presence, by internal structure, and not by rational justifications. The person who constantly tries to be understood emits a vibration of submission, of doubt. The one who no longer explains themselves emits strength, clarity, authority. And this is not about becoming arrogant. It's about finally becoming whole. People start to listen to you differently. Unbalanced relationships cease to make sense. Dynamics where you were submissive, predictable, easily controlled, simply collapse. Not because you fought, but because you are no longer available to play the same role. Silence changes the configuration of your relationships because it communicates what you once begged for. It says, "I am not here to be shaped, I am here to be." And from there, you begin to attract a different kind of connection, deeper, more honest, more aligned with who you have become. Respect starts from the inside out, and the first step is precisely to stop justifying your own existence. But this journey requires presence, because in moments of doubt, the impulse to explain yourself will return. It will seem safer to please. It will seem easier to yield. And it is in those moments that you must remember, every time you silence an explanation, you reaffirm yourself. You consolidate your integrity. You take your place in the world, and not as someone who begs for space, but as someone who already knows they belong. So now, tell me in the comments, what is the explanation you repeat the most, and that, deep down, you already know you don't want to give anymore? Maybe it's about your emotions, your boundaries, your way of being. Write it down. This is more than just a vent. It's a turning point. And if this message confronted or inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like the video, share it with those who explain themselves too much, and subscribe to the channel. The next video is also essential on this journey. Watch it now. You will understand why. Have you ever wished to be someone who is unshakable? Someone who doesn't care about criticism, rejection, loss, or betrayal? Have you ever dreamed of the day when you will finally stop feeling that silent pain, that anguish that eats you up inside, even when you pretend to be fine on the outside? Maybe you're tired of trying to please everyone, of maintaining an image that requires strength all the time, when in reality, all you wanted was to rest, just for a moment, from the pressure of being untouchable. But let me tell you something that perhaps no one has had the courage to say. As long as you try to avoid pain, it will continue to control you. As long as you try to numb yourself, to protect yourself, to hide, you will remain a hostage to everything that happens around you, to the words that hurt you, to the actions that disappoint you, to the silences that kill you inside. And this is not weakness. This is the reality for most people. The difference is that some pretend better than others. Carl Jung, one of the greatest names in depth psychology, said that we are not what happens to us, but what we choose to become. And that's where the key lies. It's not about shielding yourself from the world. It's not about becoming cold, indifferent, or untouchable. It's about integrating. It's about bringing to light everything that currently affects you in the dark. Because true strength is not the absence of pain, but the full awareness of who you are, even when you are bleeding. If you've made it this far, it's not by chance. This video is for you who are tired of hurting yourself with everything and everyone. It's for you who feel that you are always at an emotional disadvantage, as if other people have a power over you that you don't understand. I want to show you that it doesn't have to be this way, but for that, you will have to face some truths that may hurt. And perhaps, for the first time, this pain will set you free. Let's get started. You believe that what hurts you is out there, in the actions of others, in poorly chosen words, in the abandonments you have suffered, in the betrayals you did not expect. But the truth is brutal. None of this really has the power to hurt you, unless there is already an open wound inside you. What hurts you is not what others do to you. It is what these experiences activate within you. It is the story you tell yourself about it. It is the old trauma that has never been addressed. It is the emptiness you disguise with strength, with pride, with that desperate need to seem well-adjusted. Jung shows us that the pain we feel in the face of the external world is merely a reflection of what has not yet been integrated into our internal world. That is why some people can go through devastating situations and still maintain clarity, while others crumble in the face of a simple comment. It is not about what happens, it is about where it hits you. And here comes an uncomfortable truth. You still suffer so much because on some level you believe you can control how the world should treat you. You are still trying to be good enough, smart enough, strong enough, understanding enough, as if that guarantees that no one will hurt you. But control is an illusion, and as long as you cling to it, you live in constant tension, trying to predict the unpredictable, trying to avoid the inevitable. Do you want to stop suffering? Then stop protecting yourself from suffering. What you need is not more control, but more awareness. As long as you believe that people need to change for you to stop feeling pain, you will remain enslaved by the actions of others. Your freedom begins the moment you understand that everything that comes from outside only has power if it finds an echo within you. And this is exactly where the true battlefield lies, the unconscious. What you do not see, do not understand, and do not master, masters you. And this is what we will explore in the next part. Get ready to dive one level deeper, because that is where true transformation begins. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The biggest lie you've been told is that you are in control of your life. Wake up, because you're not. At least, not as long as you continue living on autopilot, reacting without knowing why, feeling without understanding where it comes from, making decisions that you later sabotage. Carl Jung made this clear when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that is exactly what is happening to you right now. The pain you feel, the anger that explodes out of nowhere, the sadness that invades you without explanation. None of this is random. They are messages coming from parts of you that have been forgotten, ignored, repressed. Jung referred to this dark territory as the unconscious. And it is not just a cloud of vague thoughts. It is an active force, an entire system of memories, traumas, desires, and fears that you do not want to face, but that continue to decide what you feel and how you act. You wonder why certain words destroy you while other people don't care. Because those words touch sensitive points within you that are still alive. And if they are alive, it is because you have never confronted them. You have only pushed them under the psychological rug, and now you keep tripping over them. Jung said, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." And what have you been doing? Judging yourself, repressing yourself, silencing yourself, as if that would solve anything. The truth is that the unconscious does not disappear just because you ignore it. It only finds more dangerous ways to manifest. In toxic relationships that you repeat, in patterns of self-sabotage that you cannot break, in anxieties and fears that arise when everything seems to be going well. This is not bad luck. It is your unconscious trying to wake you up, but you insist on sleeping. Do you want to be someone who is no longer hurt? Then stop running away from what is inside you, because as long as you do not know your unconscious, you will be a puppet of your emotions. And the more you try to protect yourself from external pain, the more vulnerable you become to internal pain. But there is a way out, and it is not in defending yourself, it is in integrating yourself. Because becoming untouchable is not an act of resistance, it is an act of deep knowledge. This is what we will see next. What does it truly mean to be someone who is unshaken? And why does this strength not come from armor, but from acceptance? Let's continue. Most people believe that the only way to avoid getting hurt is by closing themselves off. They build walls, create masks, develop emotional armor, and pretend that nothing affects them. They say, "I don't care anymore, I couldn't care less, nothing gets to me." But inside, they continue to bleed. They keep corroding. Because the problem was never about feeling. The problem is not knowing what you are feeling and why. And this only happens to those who do not yet know themselves. Jung was precise when he stated, "Know all the theories, master all the techniques, but when touching a human soul, be just another human soul." And that human soul you insist on hiding behind a strong, invulnerable, controlled character. It is screaming to be seen. Becoming emotionally strong has nothing to do with being cold. It has nothing to do with ignoring pain, avoiding conflict, or pretending not to care. It has to do with integrating, with accepting, with bringing to light everything you have buried in the dark. You do not become untouchable by creating a barrier between yourself and the world. You become untouchable when you realize that no one can touch what has already been embraced within you. When you integrate your shadows, your fears, your flaws, your insecurities, you stop reacting to everything. You observe, you choose. You are no longer an emotional puppet, and that is true freedom. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you really are. Not what others expect of you, not what you thought you should be to be accepted, but what emerges from within, from the meeting of light and shadow, between ego and unconscious. Individuation is not a process of perfection, Jung said, but of integration. You do not need to become a better person. You just need to become whole. And here is the secret that no one told you. The more you run from pain, the more it chases you. The more you try not to be affected, the more fragile you become. But when you face your own wounds, when you accept who you are, with all that is beautiful and ugly, noble and shameful, nothing outside has the power to dismantle you. However, this path requires courage. Courage to look within. Courage to abandon the masks. Courage to feel. Because it is precisely in pain that the key to transformation is hidden. And that is what we will discover in the next part. How suffering, far from being an enemy, can become the gateway to your true strength. Let's dive deeper. And this time, without fear. You learned to hate pain. Since you were little, you were taught that suffering is a sign of weakness, that crying is a waste of time, that feeling too much makes you vulnerable, and so you began to run, to avoid, to deny. But the more you flee from suffering, the more it chases you. And the worst part, it changes form. It disguises itself as anxiety, anger, apathy, boredom, self-destructive impulses that you don't even understand where they come from. Ignored pain does not disappear. It just digs tunnels inside you until one day, without warning, everything collapses. Jung saw suffering in a completely different way. He believed that pain was the messenger of the soul, the alarm of the unconscious, the language that the self, what you are in your entirety, uses to get your attention. He said, "Depression is like a lady in black. If she appears, don't push her away. Invite her to sit down, offer her a coffee, and listen to what she has to say." But you don't listen. You silence yourself, distract yourself, keep yourself busy, numb yourself. You do everything to avoid looking at what really matters. What is this pain trying to show you? The truth is that suffering only hurts so much because you are still at war with yourself. There is still a part of you wanting to grow, and another part wanting to keep everything as it is. There is something inside you that cries out for transformation, but your ego, accustomed to control, tries to suffocate that call. And it is in this friction that pain is born. Because change hurts, growth hurts. Letting go of old beliefs, cutting toxic ties, allowing what no longer serves you to die. All of this is a mourning, an internal process of death and rebirth. But it is precisely in this space of ruin that something new can be born. Because when everything in you is deconstructed, when certainties crumble, when pain lays bare your vulnerability, you can finally see who you really are without the layers of protection, without the performance, without the mask. And at that exact point, suffering becomes sacred. Because it brings you to your knees before the only thing that can set you free, yourself. Jung knew this. He understood that suffering is not a failure of the system. It is part of the process. Pain is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of the journey towards individuation. The problem is that most people give up before crossing that dark valley. They flee. They distract themselves. They return to the surface. But not you. If you have made it this far, it is because you are ready to cross. And in the next part, we will understand how this crossing process happens, how the path of individuation, no matter how lonely and brutal it may seem, is what finally sets you free. Let's continue. It's getting deeper now. Few people have the courage to begin the journey of individuation, and even fewer have the courage to complete it. Because this path does not promise comfort, does not offer guarantees, does not protect your ego, it destroys it. Jung referred to individuation as a process of becoming who you are. But this means, above all, unlearning what you think you are. And that hurts more than any external rejection, because you start to realize that much of what defined you until now was an illusion. You are not your achievements. You are not your traumas. You are not the image you constructed to be loved, respected, or admired. All of this was what you created to survive. But surviving is not living, and individuation is life's call beyond survival. It is when the unconscious begins to push everything that has been repressed, hidden, and distorted to the surface. Individuation requires the dissolution of the persona, Jung wrote, for it is merely a mask of collective convenience. In other words, you will need to tear off your own skin to discover what lies beneath. It is in this process that you begin to become untouchable. Not because nothing affects you anymore, but because you have already gone through the fire. You have faced your monsters. You have looked into the eyes of your shame, your neediness, your anger, and said, "I see you, and you no longer control me." It is this internal clarity, this lucidity in the face of your own darkness, that gives you a strength that does not depend on approval, recognition, or control. You no longer need to be loved by everyone. You no longer need to win every argument. You no longer need to appear strong, because you know who you are, and no one can take that away from you. True emotional armor is not a shell, it is a core. It is the integration of all your parts into a center of consciousness that remains unshaken in the face of storms. You may feel pain, but it does not break you. You may be hurt, but you do not lose yourself, because you have stopped being reactive and have become whole. You have stopped living on the surface and have begun to inhabit the depths. However, this depth comes at a price: loneliness. Not because you will be alone, but because few people can accompany you on this journey. Most are still trapped on the surface in masks, in the fear of feeling. And when you begin to free yourself, you inevitably distance yourself. But this distancing is not rejection. It is maturation. You do not distance yourself out of pride. You distance yourself because you no longer fit where you once hid. And this brings us to the final point of this journey: consciousness as a shield. Because it is not strength that protects you. It is clarity. This is what we will discuss in the last part. Consciousness as the only state in which nothing, absolutely nothing, has more power over you. Let's finish this crossing together. We are almost there. Now that you've made it this far, there is something that needs to be said very clearly. Nothing, absolutely nothing, will shield you from external suffering if you remain unconscious of what happens within you. The words will continue to hurt. The rejections will continue to sting. The losses will keep bringing you down until you awaken. And awakening is not a magical event. It is a daily choice. It is looking within even when it hurts. It is taking responsibility for everything you feel, without blaming others, the past, or fate anymore. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms." You have spent your whole life resisting. The fear of not being enough, the emptiness of rejection, the pain of loneliness, the anguish of not feeling seen. But what did you do with that? You hid. You silenced yourself. You tried to control everything. You tried to be perfect. You tried to be strong. And all of this has brought you here, exhausted, tired of fighting against the world and against yourself. But now you know. True emotional immunity is not hardness. It is clarity. It is not about creating armor. It is about expanding your awareness. Because when you understand your triggers, your patterns, your wounds, the actions of others lose the power to destroy you. You still feel, but you don't drown. You still suffer, but you don't lose yourself. And that changes everything. What shields you is not protecting yourself from life. It is diving into it deeply. Those who live on the surface get hurt by any wave. Those who dive know that there is silence, stability, and power down below. And that is where you're headed. And when you start to live from that place of integration, presence, acceptance, the world may try to knock you down, but it no longer finds where to hit you. If this video touched you in some way, if something within you has awakened, write here in the comments, "I choose awareness." Let's start a movement of people who no longer want to survive by pretending to be strong, but to live with truth. And don't forget, the next video is also part of this journey. It's important. You need to keep going. Real transformation only begins when you don't stop at the first step. See you there.